Hi, I'm Miss Tyler, and welcome to Context for Kids, Gospel Studies. This is our Leadership in Israel series, and this is our 5th installment on the Caesars. Because, you know, we had King Herod, but who was he under? He was under the Roman Empire. His sons were under the Roman Empire. The governors were under the Roman Empire. And so, you know, really this is our top tier of leadership now. Who were the Roman emperors? Because we go through a lot of them during biblical times, and they were different, and they had different levels of power. So it's important to know about these guys in order to kind of get a feel for the political situation that would filter down through to the Jews in Israel, in Galilee and Judea. All right, so here's the deal though. I did this one differently. You know, usually I use scholarly books, written by Christian or Romans or Middle Eastern scholars, because they're the ones doing the work, they're the ones who have translated the documents, they're the ones who are in the know. And usually that's what you have to do, because you know they've got 1,000,001 Googled pages out there who say a lot of things, but they don't give any proof as to what they're teaching. So you can't ever take those seriously. But there are some subjects that people know so much about that sometimes you can get away with online research, and the Caesars is one of those. So I don't own books on the Caesars. I just don't. I'm not really interested in studying them. I'm interested in studying people who have a direct impact on the Bible, not kind of a secondary or tertiary impact. They were farther down, well, they were farther up the food chain, way farther up the food chain. So I'll tell you what I did. In this case, I wanted to show you that you actually can sometimes do internet research. Because I know sometimes I kind of look down on it, but it just depends on what the subject matter is. If you're looking for information on other, the Babylonian religion and Canaanite religion, boy, the internet's the worst place you can go, because almost everything is just misinformation, made up, theories that have no proof and sometimes just the opposite can be proven. So I tell people to really stay away from that stuff. But when you're dealing with Roman history, a lot of what you can find online is good. Now, a lot of it isn't. It just depends, because people have agendas and they want it. But when you're talking about the identities and the history of Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, all the Caesars, there's a ton of information, and it's almost always really good. So without further ado, let's get through this. And you know, this is really PG-13, because these were nasty people. But I'm not even going to tell you very much about them, because they're just too nasty to talk about. Yeah, too nasty. Nastier than the Hasmonean, and the sons, and Herod and the sons of Herod. Anyway, so here we go. Okay, Julius Caesar. Now, we've talked about Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was in charge, well, he was part of a 3-man ruling group called a triumvirate, the first triumvirate, who were in charge of the Roman Empire during some of the late Hasmonean priest kings and Herod. Okay, but after Crassus died in 54 BC or 53 BCE, and after Pompey died in a few years after that, at the hands of Julius Caesar, actually, Caesar was declared actually the sole leader of the Roman Empire. But he only served as the leader of the Roman Empire for 5 years, all on his own. He was murdered. He was murdered by a man named Brutus, and that's made very famous by the William Shakespeare play, Julius Caesar. What else would they call it? Okay? And we also see bits and pieces of him in Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra, some of which of course is fictionalized, but there's enough historical information there because the people in that time, they were just obsessed. with the Caesars. They were a great empire. Messed up people. Now, one of Julius Caesar's greatest contributions to the modern world was the revamping of the Roman calendar, because before that it was a mess. You did not have a set number of days each month. You couldn't, as a matter of fact, you can't date things accurately according to what we would consider dating accurately before 46 BCE. You just can't. Sometimes, I mean, they were making stuff up. You know, July 15th, my birthday, was not the same day every year. You just, you know, you go back in time further than that, and unless they're talking about a celestial event in the sky that NASA can track back, we really don't know when it was. So if you see anybody saying, well, this happened on such and such a calendar date according to the Roman calendar, and it's pre-46, that's suspect. That's suspect. And scholars won't really, scholars will say, well, it was around the time of between July 25th and, you know, and this other day. Okay, they're very upfront because Julius Caesar really did modernize date making and history keeping by locking down a set in stone calendar that only had to be tweaked every once in a while. Like our leap year. But that was something that they came up with later. That's not Julius Caesar. Okay, so it was enacted in 45, and so in 45, the year began on January 1st, for the first time ever, and you know, we take this for granted now, but it was totally, and that is a really interesting thing you can look at online, is the Julian calendar. It's really fascinating, but you know, I've spent too much time on this. Okay, so I told you he was part of the first triumvirate, which went from 59 to 53, with Crassus and Pompey, and that ended once Crassus was out of the way. He was the only reason that Pompey and Julius Caesar were getting along. Remember, Pompey was the guy who took Jerusalem. He filled in the fosse, the moat on the north side of the Temple Mount, crossed it, and used siege works to get in. Now, he was killed in 44, like I said. But in 42, 2 years later, something really interesting happened. He was deified, and we're going to talk about that next week. That means the Senate declared him to be a god. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like the Egyptian pharaohs. And that sounds actually like the Eastern kings. The kings of, more like the kings of Babylon. These, as a matter of fact, did you know it wasn't until right after World War II that it was Japan worshipped the emperor as a god? He was considered a god on earth. I kid you not. I mean, the Japanese today don't look at it that way, but that was their belief. And so they fought hard because they really thought they were fighting for a god. Okay, so he was deified in 42. Why? Because of Augustus Caesar. Now, Augustus Caesar was originally Julius Caesar's nephew. His name was Gaius Octavius. He was adopted as son and heir. See, in those days, it was very common in the world that you would adopt a son to rule after you, especially if your own sons were not up to snuff. And in this case, it was his nephew. Okay? Now, in 42 BCE, Augustus Caesar became Gaius Julius Caesar Divvy Phileas. And we're going to talk about what that Divvy Phileas means because it's going to be very important to some Bible stories. All right? Now, he was emperor from 27 BCE to 14 CE. See, after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, after the defeat of Julius Caesar, it went back into a triumvirate, which is a ruling group of 3 men, like I said before. This one was Augustus, Anthony, was it Marcus Aurelius? I can't remember all of a sudden. Okay, I'll try and figure out, put it on the bottom. But again, infighting and a civil war broke out, and He defeated Antony and Cleopatra, who we talked about when we were talking about Herod. Remember, Antony was always giving Herod's land to Cleopatra because he was just so totally obsessed with her. So after Antony died and the second triumvirate dissolved, and it sounds exactly like what happened with Julius Caesar, right? First triumvirate, they couldn't get along, they fought, dissolved. Julius becomes emperor. Second triumvirate, they couldn't get along, they fought, it was dissolved, Augustus is declared emperor. So at that point, he was called Imperator Caesar Divvy Phileas Augustus. And we've got that Divvy Phileas again. Okay, so what is that? Well, we got this coin here, and I'm going to show it big on the screen. This is the Divvy Phileas coin from 28 BCE. So this was the year after Augustus became imperator, what we call emperor. And that Divvy Phileas, it means son of God. Yeah. And all the emperors after him had Divvy Phileas coins. They were called the son of, and Augustus is a word meaning kind of divine. So the son of the divine, he was called the son of the divine Caesar, the son of God. They had declared Julius Caesar God. Augustus was his son. Therefore, Augustus was the son of God. And next week we're going to read about how seriously they took that. I'm looking forward to that. Imperial cult it was terrible, but it's also really really cool and interesting and funny. All right, so at the death of Augustus Caesar, supposedly at the hand of his wife, Livia. Okay, so Tiberius Caesar took over. Now Tiberius reigned from 14 to 37 of the Common Era. And that puts him, Augustus was ruling when Yeshua, otherwise known as Jesus, was born. Okay? You know, in the days when it became a divine decree by Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. That's in Luke. But from 14 to 37, Tiberius was the emperor, the Caesar. So he was the emperor for all of Yeshua's adult life. So when we hear things like, we have no king but Caesar, they were talking about this guy. All right? He was the guy who would have been in charge of the appointment of Pontius Pilate. Well, actually, the Senate would have done it, but he would have been, he's Pontius Pilate's boss. He was the son-in-law of Augustus. He was also the stepson of Augustus because he was Augustus's wife's son who married Augustus's daughter. I should have done another one of those horrible family trees because this is just worse than the Herods. But we're not going to do that. You don't need to know this. I'm just giving you the information. There will be no test at the end. Okay. Now, John the Baptist started preaching during the 15th year of Tiberius. That's what the Bible tells us. That would have been 28 of the Common Era. Like I said, when Pilate offered the people gathered in the Praetorium the chance to release Yeshua, Jesus, instead of Barabbas, and they wanted Barabbas, he says, but isn't this your king? And they said, we have no king but Caesar. That was the Sadducees, and we're getting ready to talk about the Sadducees. They were messed up. So let's talk about Divvy Phileas, son of God. Because this is one of those situations where it really pays to know about what's in the Bible. This is Mark chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. I will put it up big so you can see it. Then they sent him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians. Now the Pharisees were a denomination of Judaism. They were also a political group. The Herodians were the Jews who were loyal to the Romans in a really rabid way, and especially to the sons of Herod, to catch him in his words, in in Yeshua's, Jesus' words. They wanted to get him to the point where they could discredit him. They were always trying to shame him. If you've read Honor and Shame in the Bible, you totally get this. When they had come, they said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one. For you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay? But he, knowing their hypocrisy, they didn't care about this. They'd already made up their minds. The Pharisees and the Herodians both paid taxes. They didn't see anything wrong with it because it wasn't breaking any commandments. But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, Why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius so that I may see it. And they brought it. And he said to them, Whose image and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. Okay, so let's look at that coin again. Caesar's coin. Okay? Here we see Caesar. And we see Divvy Phileas. So that's his coin, his inscription. And they said it was Caesar's. And Jesus answered them and said, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. So what's the big deal here? Let's look at this. What does that coin say? Well, one, that coin had an image of a face on it. And the Jews all said that they believed that this was idolatry, especially they're declaring him as a god on a coin. This is actually an idolatrous coin. There's no way around it. It says he's the Son of God. All right, is he the Son of God? I don't think so. No. All right, so this is not Tiberius's coin. This is Augustus's coin. This is the original Divvy Phileas coin. Tiberius had his own, Caligula had his own, Claudius had, they all had their own. Okay, so this coin is idolatrous, and it is saying that Caesar is the son of God. Whoops. And so really what Yeshua is saying, do you really want this coin? Really? Are we talking about this? Is this an issue? Do you want this coin with this dude's face on it saying he is the Son of God? Is that cool with you guys? Give it back to him if he wants it. And they marveled at him because it's like, well, I guess we can't argue with that. But like I said, they weren't really asking him a question. They were trying to trap him. They wanted him to say, no, it's an idolatrous image, and it's idolatry to pay taxes to him, and no, wasn't breaking any of God's laws. But why should they want to hold on to it? So he gave them an answer they agreed with, and they couldn't argue with. He's so awesome. All right. No king but Caesar. Again, we're talking about Tiberius because he was the Caesar when this happened. John 19:12-15. From then on, Pontius Pilate, sought to release him, Yeshua, Jesus. But the Jews cried out saying, now you got it in the context, this isn't just Jews in general. These were the chief priests, okay? And the crowd they whipped up. This is not all Jews. As a matter of fact, at one point, 20% of Jews were believers in him. So make sure you're not blanket statementing everybody. All right. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you let and actually this is one of those cases where I told you, does it mean Jew or does it mean Judean? It means Judean, okay? But the Judeans cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. Well, here's the deal. Yeshua, Jesus, King of the Jews. And he had just told Pilate in front of everyone that I am a king. My kingdom is not of this world. If it was of this world, then my followers would rise up and defend it. Okay? And he had called himself king. And he had called himself the Son of Man, the Son of Adam, the Son of, over and over and over again. But also, whenever he was called the Son of God, or someone would call him the Son of God, they were calling him the Davidic king. We've talked about that too. The Son of God is a legal term meaning the king who comes from the line of David through Solomon, because God adopted Solomon and all of his kingly heirs. Not every son of Solomon, not every son of David. Okay? You can find that one in another teaching I did about David and Solomon. All right. So, whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. And last week I told you that when you claimed a higher authority than Caesar, when you challenged Caesar, when you rebelled against the authority of the Caesars to rule, there was only one penalty for that, and that was crucifixion. Everyone who was crucified was a political rebel. All right, so when Pilate therefore heard that, see, when whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar, Pilate heard that, he would have been terrified, because he would have been up for crucifixion. To let another king live, to let a king claimant live. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in the place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now, it was the preparation day of the Passover and about the 6th hour. So this would have been noon. Excuse me. This is the preparation day of the Passover. This is the day that the Passover lambs were slaughtered. Okay? The preparation day of the Passover. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." This is about 3 hours before they started sacrificing the Passover lambs, by the way. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered. Remember, I told you this was the chief priests. Not all the Jews. This was specific context. The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Okay, because if they'd claimed another king, they'd all be crucified too. It was a very scary time to be alive, although the chief priests are the ones that created this situation, so I'm not letting them off the hook. We're going to talk about them in a few weeks, and they were nasty. All right, so that was Tiberius. The next Caesar we are not going to talk about much because he was the most messed up person. He made Herod look like a choir boy. He reigned from 37 to 41 of the Common Era. He was the grandnephew and adopted grandson of Tiberius. He oppressed the Alexandrian Jews like you would not believe. Massive oppression and slaughtering and everything. His family, the rest of his family, actually conspired against Tiberius, the last emperor. And he was the only survivor of his family. Like I said, he was one of the most messed up people in history. He tried to actually have his own statue set up in the temple in Jerusalem, but he died before it could happen. He was actually assassinated at age 28. Now, there was this really cool Roman centurion guy who was actually given the job of setting up Caligula's statue in the temple in Jerusalem, but he knew what was going to happen. He was actually religiously very sensible. He was dragging his feet. He found everything to do other than obey Caligula. And so finally, the guy died. He didn't have to do it. Praise God. That would have been another Jewish war right there. All right. So he was assassinated at age 28 by his own soldiers, as I recall. Then there was Claudius. If you've ever seen there was a miniseries called I, Claudius. It was about this guy. He reigned from 41 to 54 of the Common Era. He was the uncle of Caligula. He appointed Agrippa I, the king of Judea. He restored rights to the Alexandrian Jews. So after the persecutions of Caligula, Claudius really set things back kind of into sanity. By the way, Alexandria was one of the largest centers of Jews in the world outside the land and outside of Babylon. They even had their own temple there down in Egypt. So let's see. In Acts 11:28, it talks about a famine that occurred in the time of Claudius. So he's actually mentioned in the Bible, so we can date that to within his reign. But he was responsible for the expulsion of Jews from Rome and what we see in Acts 18:2 That's according to the historian Tacitus. He was poisoned by his wife. I know these guys keep getting poisoned by their wife. Yeah, that's how Livia was supposed to have killed Augustus. Then we get Nero. Now, what's Nero famous for? Fiddling while Rome burned. Now, that's actually an interesting story. Now, he reigned from 54 to 68 of Common Era. He actually committed suicide because he was so unpopular and he knew that things were getting bad for him, so he just decided to take matters into his own hands. He was emperor while Paul was imprisoned. So when Paul was taken to Rome, it's Nero who he would have spoken in front of. Okay, so that's not everybody does it. That's cool. It dates everything. He was the son of Emperor Claudius's wife, who he executed later, but you know she had actually killed Claudius, so that's understandable. But he was killing. I mean, that's the thing. He killed his mom. At least Herod never killed his mom. Kill everybody else, but not his mom. Don't kill your mom, guys. He started the Great Fire of 64 of the Common Area, not the 64 California. That's incorrect. He wanted to build a palace in a certain impoverished area, and he decided, well, if he just set fire to everything, well, it would be clear real estate. No problem. Gets rid of all those pesky zoning regulations and, planning commission meetings. Of course, he blamed it on Christians later. He was the emperor at the beginning of the Jewish revolt in 66. And he actually was the end of what's called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And we're just going to talk really quick about two more. They aren't Caesars, okay? They aren't from that line, but they do weigh into Bible events. Vespasian, he reigned from 69 to 79 after the year of 4 emperors. After the Julio-Claudian line, starting with Julius Caesar and ending with Nero, fell. Of course, there was a great power struggle, and they had 4 emperors in 1 year, and the one that came out on top was Vespasian. He was the legate over the forces that was sent to put down the Jewish revolt. Last week we talked about legates versus prefects and procurators. It means he was a senatorial status, and of course he never would have been given the emperorship if he wasn't senatorial, right? Obviously. All right, so he was a legate over the forces sent to put down the Jewish revolt, which he turned over to his son Titus when he saw a chance to be emperor, so he hustled back. He was actually the patron of the historian Josephus, who we quote all the time. And his son Titus was the next emperor after him. He overcame the Jewish resistance in 70 CE. He destroyed the temple and quite a bit of Jerusalem, not all of Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, if you go online and you look up the Herodian quarter, you can see buildings from the time of Messiah that are still in amazing condition that they've unearthed. So, people say that there was a time in the Gospel of Matthew, it talks about where his disciples saying, look at all these buildings, what splendor, and Yeshua, Jesus said, look, enjoy them now, but, not one stone will be left on another. Well, that was only up on the Temple Mount. Everything that was up on the Temple Mount was toppled. And I showed you the trumpeting stone that was directly south of where Josephus said it would be, which was so totally cool. And that thing weighed like tons. Nobody hauled that up north. Okay, so I want to talk to you. That's it for this week, and we're going to talk about imperial cult next week. And I hope this wasn't just confusing, but remember, I'm just giving you an overview. I want you to kind of be familiar with all the different confusing things that are going on. No test. There's never any tests in anything I do. Yeah, it's not pointless. Besides, it's summer. Okay, so let's talk about losing control. Oh, did you notice my new guy last week? I got Willy Wonka. The real Willy Wonka. Did you know he was Jewish? The guy who played him, Gene Wilder, one of my favorite actors. Anyway, so let's talk about losing control. Now, one of the things I see on social media a lot is a lot of people, there's this meme. Maybe I'll find it and I'll put it up. And it says, when you're asking, what would Jesus do? Remember that overturning tables and whipping people are among the options. But we need to understand that he did that twice in his life, and it was because people were defiling the Temple Mount. Very serious, encroaching upon the throne of God on earth. That building and that place was meant to be a house of prayer for all nations. People from all over the world, whether they were Jews or not, could come up there and worship God. They were honoring him. They were offering sacrifices to give him things and to have a covenant meal with him. Okay? And there were people up there robbing folks. They made a crazy atmosphere. And they weren't being honest. And you can't be dishonest in God's name. And so when that happened, yeah, he overturned their tables so they could stop defiling God's house. And he made a whip and he chased them off of the Temple Mount. And that was pretty much the last straw for him. When he did that the second time, they came after him in a big way. And the thing is, he only did that twice in his life. We only have, and he wasn't losing control. It was very controlled. A lot of people, they want to lose their temper at everyone who disagrees. But we don't see Messiah doing that. We see him being very self-controlled and even very understanding. Now, there were times when people made honor challenges against him to try and shame him, and he had to deal with that. And he had to get back at them. But we don't see him picking fights. We don't see him taking cheap shots at people. We see a very controlled person. And Paul once said something that really struck me. He talked about the kindness of Christ. The kindness of God in Christ. We have to remember that he was the epitome of how we're supposed to act. He was loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, gentle, faithful, good, self-controlled. We can't lose control and say that the Spirit just moved on us. The Spirit doesn't make us lose control. So remember, when we lose it, that is not God working through us. That's our own offense. So be careful, and always be careful which of your actions you attribute to the Holy Spirit. Because we don't have the right to do what we want and then later say, oh, well, that was God. Yeah, totally approved of everything I did. Anyway, well, that is Context for Kids this week. Like I said, I know this stuff is complex, and I don't expect you to know it. This gives you an idea what it is out there to study, and it'll make more sense of the stuff that we're going to cover later. This political stuff is crazy, I know, but it's worth it. Anyway, I love you, I'm praying for you, and I hope you have a wonderful week studying Scripture together as a family. Bye-bye now.